Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for this opportunity. I was just really thrilled to hear Dr. Singh and Liz share from their research because I'm also a graduate from St. John's University. And so happy to hear folks doing incredible research there. So thank you to the organizers for this opportunity. Nelson, Derek, Mark, so many LACUNY committee members and all those involved, our facilitators today, Diane and Juanette. So it's so great to have everyone come together to talk about these important issues and concepts in our profession. I'm also a City University of New York Queens College graduate, so I'm really humbled to be part of this community because I have never been a participant of LACUNY. So I don't work in LACUNY or in New York, but I'm thankful to be invited to join this space. And so my name is Raymond, pronouns are he and him, and I'm an academic and research librarian at the Alder Graduate School of Education. So I'm a solo librarian in a really important position where I support teacher educators and pre-service teachers in the state of California. So it is a teacher's education program, a master's program, which I'll definitely get into as well. But the most important part is that when we think about professional development, we also often have to think about our school librarian colleagues and our teachers. Because as we know through shows like Abbott Elementary, it's a real issue where they don't have professional development, where they have to spend their own money for resources, supplies, training. They don't get the time. And it's incredibly difficult. And I think it's one thing to discuss ways to help them frame what they're doing and how do they encourage ways to advance or encourage ways to grow their teaching practices, right? And so that's what I've been doing as a teacher educator, as a librarian, and in any of the roles I do within Alder. But first, I also want to acknowledge this week is Teachers Appreciation Week. And so I want to thank all our educators here in this space because all of you, including our non-teaching educating folks, we're all librarians, we're all working together, library workers. And so it's important that we recognize and appreciate our colleagues, our teachers, those who have shaped us who we are today, because teachers are certainly an important force in our lives. And we also need to recognize the burnout, the difficulties that they're experiencing, and the challenges in systemic oppression, inequity, and so forth. And all of that can be discussed through really thoughtful conversation, which is why I'm here today to talk about this topic on unpacking information privilege as well as diversity within a professional development program that I work with our teachers. So first, what is Alder? So Alder Graduate School of Education is a teacher's education program in the state of California. Our goal is to train, retain, and support excellent teachers, especially teachers of color, because we know it's so important to diversify the teaching workforce and to be reflective of the communities that we serve. And so when we think about our teachers that we have seen and have been taught from, and so we're thinking about that representation, right? And it's so important to think about how that is to see someone who is like you as a teacher. So we really strive for that. It's a one-year master's program. It's a teaching credential program. I teach in the master's pathway program. It's very intensive because there are 400 plus graduate students who are pre-service teachers placed throughout the state of California. We partner with district unified or public or charter schools. And then we have our residents do a one-year-long mentorship apprentice program. And at the same time, they're getting their master's degree and going through a rigorous program to learn about whole child, whole adult pedagogy, EDI, as well as other important framework to enhance their understanding of teaching and what that means. And so for me, it's been an honor to be part of this community because I have worked closely with so many teachers and training them to think thoughtfully and really become the best teachers that they can to serve their communities. And so one of the ideas that we really think about is our positionality. And so when we think about our positionality, where we're coming from, our upbringings, we need to also think about our biases and privilege. And so I share here a graphic that was created by Sylvia Duckworth. It's called the Wheel of Power and Privilege. And you can see this diagram. It's showing the different degrees to which a person can be marginalized or have power over others in society based on their characteristics. Now you see the locus there. It says power. So that's the center of power. That's how society has been operating. But then when we take a step back, we look at the marginalized. And for example, you can see undocumented, documented, and citizen. And what does that mean in the layers of your positionality? And so it's so important to think about that as teachers, because it impacts how we research, read, write, and critically engage with our students, with texts, with our colleagues. When we think about this diagram here and the representation, we think about authentic experiences, and we think about how we can elevate each other and sort of dismantle these systemic inequities that exist in society, but also in the teaching workforce in general. So as a librarian, I teach workshops. Of course, many of us do in terms of embedded workshops, but also on the side with professional development with other colleagues to really foster that understanding of thoughtfulness of where we are in our positionality. And so 300 plus graduate students would meet with me either in person or online. And really we have these thoughtful discussions. And this diagram is really reflective of the concept of intersectionality. And for those who are not familiar, the concept of intersectionality is a legal concept coined by legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw, which looks at the understanding of ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves and create obstacles that often are not understood among conventional ways of thinking. So you could be middle class, you could be white, but you could also be transgender. And what does that say about these different identities and how you be able to navigate in the teaching workforce and how you engage with the text that you're reading that's on burnout or some sort of thoughtful theoretical framework like critical race theory. So we think about these discussions through a series of questions. And these are some of the questions we thought we discussed as a group. What biases do we carry as teachers? How do we perceive our students? How do we grade our students? Because it all comes in with how we are shaped by our own experiences and our positionality. So I share that as one graphic because that was one way to really get our students to really think about their own experiences in relations to their work as teachers. Now, the second concept is information privilege. It leads to this really other important critical concept. So you're probably wondering, what is information privilege if you haven't heard of it before? So I will share that information privilege is basically a critical concept that discusses the affordances and power to having information access. So what does that look like? So visually here, we can see an image created by Hannah Rozier from Duke University. This graphic shows basically a column for high school and a column for college. And then you see a book bag saying information privilege, right? And it's really coined based on Peggy McIntosh, a 1989 essay called White Privilege. And it describes a privilege in a sense of having access to resources to be advantageous, right, over others in everyday situation. And so we need to think about how we need to have conversation with students to think about their own experiences getting information access, but also like how they are situated in their placements, right? And so we have this really good discussion here. You can see, for example, in high school, you can probably reflect on your own right now as you're reading this. You might have access to a library in high school, or maybe you didn't. And what would that have shaped your experience? How would you be a different person today if you had internet access growing up, right? And certainly I didn't have internet access growing up. I went to the library every day. So what would that difference would have made? And also in college too, right? You're looking at that, having access where you have a professor who's encouraging, supportive. You have a library that can give you textbooks. Certainly, unfortunately, at the time at St. John's University, OER did not exist, right? And so I am so happy that we're like pushing for open pedagogy, open educational resources, because our students deserve that. And the library should be making things available. And when you have things more available, then you think about having access, because we hear all these stories where students have to decide, do I pay for rent, food, or a textbook? And that's the cost when it comes to information privilege. And so we think about that as a group. We think and reflect on our own experiences in our placements. So in the schools where all of our teachers are based throughout the state of California, and what that looks like. And unfortunately, many of them have shared with me, they don't have a school library. So they build their own library, like many classrooms usually have. And they don't have a school librarian. Or if they do have a library, they don't have a school librarian, like Abbott Elementary. because of funding issues. And so we need to think about what that means and how that shapes their students too. So when I have those conversations, they start thinking, wow, we need to find ways to advocate for school librarians. We need to have more school librarians. It's not necessarily holding space for a library, but to engage with literacy, multimedia content, and also having the support, right, that our teachers really need in terms of library support. And so we do this exercise where we have students come together and then sort of circle virtually, like which one stood out to them, which one they had access to, which ones they didn't. And then we get into an opportunity to search in our databases, right? And using that framework, okay? So if they have access to select databases at the Alder Graduate School of Education, what if they didn't, right? What if they had like very limited databases or any resources? Then they start reflecting on that and the importance of library resources, the importance of lacking resources too, and what difference would that make in their lives and in their students' lives. And now in the third transition, I want to talk about diversity in children's books. Okay, so we move into this area because it's so important right now to think about the relevant materials that we teach for literacy, to engage with our students in multiple subjects or in P6 environments, that P6 as in preschool to 6th grade. And so this is a question I pose to all of you here. Think and reflect, what were your favorite books as a child, right? And this is a prompt I also ask students. Usually it's a think, pair, share with an elbow partner if it's in person, or a Zoom breakout group where they think as a pair to think about, well, what were some favorite children's books that they had growing up? And so as you're thinking through that, please feel free to share in the chat box, give it a minute. What were some children's books that you enjoyed reading growing up? And as people are thinking about it, I might say we've had our students say, oh, they enjoy Harry Potter, or they enjoy Hungry Caterpillar, or some other types of books. Thank you. I see Where the Sidewalk Ends, the Babysitter Clubs, the anthologies of Sounds of Mystery and Sounds of a Young Hunter. Great. Thank you for sharing that. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, Goosebumps for sure. Yeah. Thank you. So it's kind of nostalgic, right? You're thinking about your children's books that you had cherished because it shaped who you are as an adult right now. And then there's this also important part where we need to have a discussion. We need to interrogate the publishing world. As people are sharing, I want to share this graphic here. So this is a diversity in children's book that was published in 2018, an infographic by David Hoig and Sarah Park-Dahlen, which in consultation with many people you can see on the right. And it is coming in from the Cooperative Children's Book Center, CCBC, looking at the multicultural publishing statistics. And it's kind of harrowing, right? Even though it's 2023, 5 years, it hasn't, I believe, it hasn't changed that much. And unfortunately, this is the perspective that children are getting these days. And it's not surprising necessarily, but to see it framed this way, where we see even animals and toys getting more attention than our BIPOC students or children and that experience. And what does that say when you're socialized and conditioned to look at animal, other, and white, right? And you don't identify as that. And then it's sort of conditioning you into thinking this is the perspective, right? And so when we have our teachers think about this, look at this graphic, it's like really powerful. So I'm thankful for those who have been working on this for many years to push it out there, because certainly it has a lot of information to just share with that graphic. We do a think, pair, share discussion. We really have our students write about what they've seen and sort of like think about what they just saw and how do they make sense of it, right? How would they shape the publishing world from their own situation as teachers? And then as a result, we also ask this really important question, right? What does it mean to you, this graphic? And what does it mean to see representation for you and for your students? So you're thinking of their students that they're serving. And as a result, we do this assessment where they're able to really sort of reflect informally on their own, thinking about representation in scholarship, because it's not just in children's literature, it's also in scholarship and in general literature as a key way of understanding marginalized experiences and voices and power within the publishing industry and how that shapes what we do as educators. And so for those who are like, well, how do you assess all these professional development learning? So we do this sort of informal summative assessment, which is like assessment with 2 questions. Or I guess it would be more formative assessment. What questions do you still have about searching, and what is one takeaway? So then they think about what was just shared, and then they do some workshop in terms of sharing and looking up children's books titles that they had that research has been done, right? And then start interrogating what maybe they thought they really enjoyed. Maybe there was some other issues that they did not consider. And so we lined this up closely with the work that the Association of College and Research Libraries has done, which is the Education and Behavioral Social Sciences section. I align it with this framework, the Framework for Information Literacy. They have a companion document that came out from 2021 to 2022. So you can see the names of the committees there. And it's a really important framework. So it aligns information literacy with education programs within teachers' education. And so you can see some of the areas here: teacher professional practice. So it's so important to really think about multiple perspectives, engaging with teachers professionally, teacher pedagogy practice. So having students learn about diverse perspectives, additional voices, schools of thought, teacher preparation education. So as my role to really share that awareness for individuals and groups to think about those that are underrepresented and systematically marginalized within the systems of our databases, of our publishing world, as well as in society in general, right? And think about how that impacts their lives as individuals and as teachers. So I think, yeah, this document, as well as all the other slide deck information, will be shared later. So you can take a deeper dive if you want to get into that. And I wanted to share that this sort of final quote here, which is so critical here. You know, ultimately, the lens we bring in teaching, research, writing, and reading can bring insight into how we interpret, describe, process, and build on things, and how we shape others' experiences and create meaning. And because we create meaning, that's really key here. We're creating and shaping other people's experiences as teachers and educators. We need to really take that seriously and with intentionality. So I kind of end here, and thank you again so much for your time and attention. Happy to take any questions at the end, and I'll share the slide deck shortly.
Well, thank you, Raymond, for such a great presentation. We'll move on to our next presenter.
So let me introduce Tina Liu. Am I saying your last name right, Tina?
Yep.
Who will be sharing their presentation, The Imposter Among Us, How Imposter Syndrome Among Racialized Information Professionals is Fueled by Diversity Discourses. Welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Right. If no one says anything, I'm going to assume that we're all looking at my screen.
Yes.
Right. This is great. My slides don't want to come up. I'm just going to give up and let it be this way because it doesn't want to work with me. Right. So, hello, I'm Tina. I'm the librarian for business and economics at Wilfrid Laurier University in Waterloo, Canada. I'm Canadian, so my approach to diversity, as I found, it tends to differ a little bit from American perspectives, but that is something I'll touch on a little bit more in my presentation. So I'm talking about imposter syndrome and how imposter syndrome, as experienced by racialized information professionals, fits within the diversity model. So to give a brief overview of what to expect from me, I'm going to start with defining imposter syndrome and then introducing what I mean when I say the diversity model. Then I'm going to move into critiques of how the diversity model functions within the information profession to uphold racial hierarchies. And then from there, I'm going to move into critiques of imposter syndrome and demonstrate the parallels between upholding racial hierarchies in the diversity model and offloading institutional responsibility for these inequities and injustices through pathologizing imposter syndrome. So the main thread connecting these 2 points is how the diversity model and the pathologization of imposter syndrome tend to sift institutional shortcomings into personal failures. And finally, I'll close with some thoughts on how we can address imposter syndrome as pathology versus the affective experience of having imposter syndrome. So my approach to imposter syndrome is fairly straightforward. It's based on the presence of 3 main indicators, which I've taken from Joan Harvey and Cynthia Cates' outline of imposter syndrome. These indicators are believing that one has fooled others into overestimating one's own abilities, attributing personal success to factors other than one's ability or intelligence. So for example, you got to where you are because of luck or extra work or charisma or evaluators' misjudgment, but not because of your own ability. And finally, another aspect of imposter syndrome is just being feared that someone is going to expose you for not being what they currently think you are. On the other hand, the diversity model is more complicated. It emerges from the oversimplified framing of racial inequity as something that can be solved by simply throwing diverse bodies at it. So David James Hudson describes the diversity model as a trope of multiculturalism concerned chiefly with questions of representation. Diversity is the central sign under which we can acknowledge and problematize the predominant whiteness of a field, formulate solutions, and express ideals, as well as positioning ourselves in relation to the racialized dynamics of the broader communities within which we are situated. This sentiment is echoed by Sophia Leong and Jorge Lopez McKnight, because they write, library and information studies has framed the race problem as one of diverse representation of racialized bodies, rather than one of racial power, domination, and privilege. To further this idea of diversity as a tool that just promotes whiteness, a nationwide US study carried out by sociologists at the University of Minnesota found that positivity towards diversity is also associated with core cultural ideologies which normalize racial inequity and implicitly denigrate minorities, such as colorblind racism and meritocracy. A coherent and distinct recognition of diversity exists in the American imagination, and that diversity discourse has a double-edged relationship with racial hierarchy. I do find this last study to be the most striking, and it echoes a lot of criticism towards Canadian multicultural discourse from scholars such as Himani Banerjee. These constructive narratives of diversity and multiculturalism serve to depoliticize and neutralize racial and cultural discourse because they tend to shift the narrative to frame diversity and multiculturalism as proof of how open-minded and welcoming this society is to racialized bodies, when in fact that open-mindedness comes with stipulations and is only really offered to those who are able to perform this perceived whiteness to an acceptable degree. I think a lot about Jane Hyung's 2005 book that introduced the concept of the bamboo ceiling because it very much plays into the overarching narrative of whiteness. As much as Hyung critiques the lack of Asian managers in corporate America, the goal of, in her book, her goal of introducing Asian managers to dominant management practices and workplace cultures really just serves to uphold the same hegemonic practices that led to the exclusion of Asian managers in the first place. So these quotes that I've pulled also demonstrate how our approach to racial inequities are restricted by its framing within a white liberal discourse, because the goal of the diversity model is to diversify the bodies echoing white liberal sentiments, not to challenge those hegemonic sentiments. So one recurring criticism that came up in my reading was that of diversity residencies and diversity scholarships, because such programs allow institutions to outsource the work of diversity to individuals. And on an individual level, there are a lot of benefits to these programs because it does provide experience and financial support to individuals who likely need that support. But the creation of these programs and awards also ignores the history of racial power struggles in library and information structures. So while I see these programs as kind of a short-term solution, they're another band-aid solution which do have important effects, but they're a solution that ignores that history of racial power struggles, and that's not a solution to the actual problem. So instead, such solutions in some ways almost undermine the problem that they're intended to address and end up upholding these inequitable standards instead. Promoting diversity residencies and initiatives allows the information profession to exhibit how much they care about ameliorating the racial power divide, but it doesn't actually offer an effective, sustainable solution. Instead, just hiring more racialized bodies into the profession is a method of outsourcing diversity to individuals so institutions can wash their hands of the responsibility. And that's not a sustainable method for any sort of EDI practice, because I think EDI is something that needs to be embedded in your work itself, not just in superficial policies like hiring more racialized bodies, but also in thinking about how you treat those bodies, what kind of roles you're hiring those bodies into, but also just the nature of the work environment that you're expecting those bodies to perform for you. And the struggle between individual responsibility versus systemic inequities brings me back to the question of imposter syndrome. So in 2021, Ruchika Tulsian and Jodi Ambiri published an article titled "Stop Telling Women They Have Imposter Syndrome," which they published in the Harvard Business Review. It's a very provocative title that I don't entirely agree with, but I'll come back to that in a little bit. For now, I want to focus on the key observation they make, because I found it to be eerily reminiscent of the same problem found in diversity discourses, which is the problem of shifting the blame for structural problems onto individuals. So Tulsian and Ambiri write that imposter syndrome puts the blame on individuals without accounting for the historical and cultural contexts that are foundational to how it manifests in both women of color and white women. Imposter syndrome directs our view towards fixing women at work instead of fixing the places where women work. So in their article, we can see how imposter syndrome functions very similarly to the diversity model, because it shifts responsibility for a structural problem onto the individuals within that structure. Imposter syndrome is very symptomatic of how institutional biases prevent individuals from marginalized communities from fully thriving in their professional environment, while at the same time it pushes responsibilities for any negative feelings onto the individual. Nicola Andrews makes a similar observation in her article on imposter syndrome in library workers, where she says the imposter phenomenon has persisted for over 40 years. And evidence suggests that it is not just a product of individual neuroses, but often one of collective anxiety due to neoliberal pressures, racism, sexism, and bias against minoritized people. And among librarians, imposter syndrome is an extremely common phenomenon. Jessica Martinez and Meredith Forey published an article in 2019 on overcoming imposter syndrome, and they found that among 172 librarians, 85% of them share that they experience some degree of imposter syndrome, which is just a massive number. And universities often have dedicated sections on their web pages for imposter syndrome as well, talking about how it affects students, faculty, and staff. And some of the schools that have done this include the University of Waterloo, the University of Toronto, Harvard, and Princeton. Yet despite these limitations of imposter syndrome framing systemic failures as individual shortcomings, it's also very clear that imposter syndrome is a very real component of being a librarian and being an academic. So this is where I want to separate the notion of imposter syndrome as pathology from the affective experience of imposter syndrome. Nicola Andrew acknowledges this as he says, claiming the label of having imposter syndrome can be a relief. It can allow you to articulate your struggle. to develop a shared understanding of it with others. And so while the label of imposter syndrome can feel like a burden, it also functions as a convenient shorthand for capturing and conveying these complex feelings in the workplace. I mentioned a little earlier that I didn't love the title of Ruchika Telshin and Jody Embury's Harvard Business Review piece. And that's because removing imposter syndrome from our lexicon entirely still doesn't adequately improve the circumstances of the problem they've identified. There is, unfortunately, a reason why imposter syndrome has become so prevalent. And so not referring to imposter syndrome as such isn't going to stop people from experiencing it. But I do agree with them in that we should not be pathologizing and diagnosing people with imposter syndrome simply because they voiced their discomfort in the workplace. We need to move away from that pathological model of imposter syndrome because pathologizing and diagnosing imposter syndrome only really continues this trend of allowing institutions to dissociate themselves from the consequences of these structural problems. And when such a stark majority of your workforce experiences imposter syndrome, there clearly is very much the workplace and boilerplate solutions like visualizing success or speaking up about your failings really does nothing to address the root cause of the issue. And I'm also not convinced they're even a good band-aid solution. Visualizing success and speaking up about your feelings, by the way, are examples of strategies for managing imposter syndrome that I pulled directly off of a large research university's website. And so a lot of the advice I find regarding imposter syndrome tends to fall into one of two categories. So either the advice is really short-term coping mechanisms, like the examples I mentioned a moment ago, or the advice is for managers on how to enact top-down cultural changes. And while these both feel like very temporary band-aid solutions, until the underlying social inequalities are addressed, individuals really will need to continue to require this room to navigate their feelings of inadequacy in the workplace. And so one solution I would propose for kind of trying to get to the root issue is not to stop doing anything that we're currently doing, but to try to approach it from a different view. And so there's a lot of documentation on why don't EDI or DEI or whatever iteration of the acronym your institution using, like why don't they work? And they don't work because of that institutional tendency to kind of outsource problems to people, to individuals, or to groups of individuals, rather than really addressing the real difficulties in. Because really what this requires is a collective mindset change on the individual level. And so to do that, a lot of the work can't just be policies to get more diverse bodies into the buildings, but also to think about how do we support those bodies, and like really understanding what those bodies bring to the table that aren't already there, because they bring a lot, but you need to understand what they bring other than just they bring something. And so that is it for my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I am happy to answer any questions now.
Thank you so much, Tina. So we've technically reached the end of time for this session, but we built in some breaks between the now and the next concurrent panel. So if you have questions for Tina or Ray or comments, please share them now. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself and carry on with your question. We do have some interesting things that were shared in the comments. If anyone will, thank you, Isabel. Please unmute yourself.
Tina and Ray, both of you, this was excellent. Just responding to Tina, because that's like the freshest on my mind right now. Sorry, Ray, I have to think back to your presentation, but this is really excellent, Tina, because I do hear so many people still internalizing and blaming themselves. And the other thing that I feel is like there's a pressure that you have to feel it. Like I tell people, I don't have imposter syndrome. I know I don't have this. I don't feel like I don't deserve, I don't belong, but everyone wants me to, you know? So that's also interesting. I don't know if you have anything to say to that, but I've been following this for this very reason. So I appreciate it. And I put something in the chat, which is there is a professor, I think Gutierrez is her last name, and she talks about imposterization. Like, what is it that's making people feel this way, and focusing on that instead?
Yes, thank you for your comment. I did see your article and it looks great. So I will be reading that once this panel ends. To comment on this idea that you're kind of feel like you're expected to feel imposter syndrome, I very much agree with that. I have a complicated relationship with imposter syndrome because while I don't necessarily feel like I don't belong where I am, I'm still, I think I tend to vacillate wildly between feeling like this is absolutely exactly what I deserve. I am phenomenal. This is exactly where I should be. And then swinging right back the other way to what if I'm just a fraud and everyone's going to pick up on it soon. And so I think a lot of like our discourse about imposter syndrome is really one-dimensional. And so it discusses like, it talks about imposter syndrome being there, but there are so many different ways and layers to how people experience imposter syndrome. And so it's not really the clear cut, I have it or I don't have it, but sometimes I experience it this way, whereas other times it's kind of just not there because no one has the energy to be miserable at work all the time. And so I do think part of addressing that issue is also just thinking about how like no one deserves to feel imposter syndrome, and it really sometimes I feel like it's become a rite of passage in academia. Like if you don't feel imposter syndrome, then like you're not a real academic.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that
right,
is
yeah.
just so there are so many layers to why that is wrong.
Yeah, but but it's real. I know a lot of people actually feel it, and I'm not negating that at all. And I want to tell anyone who feels it, it's not you. It's not you.
Thank you for that. Ray, do you feel like some of this, I saw your comment here in the chat, do you feel like some of this deficit thinking shows up in teacher education, or like we see it show up in the publishing industry? I'm certain that there's not a lack of ideas for children's books by people of color, but that's not represented in what is published. And a lot of the popular books about children of color are not written by people of color. And I don't think that there's a lot of awareness about that either.
Yeah, great comment there. Really briefly, I think the deficit thinking frames into us as reductive, right? It tends to be like you said, maybe it's not the authentic representation by those illustrators or authors, but also like it's always like focusing on some sort of trope narrative that is like, and we all know what those trope narratives are, that are just no joy, right? There's no other nuance. It's just like you're reduced to these categories because it's easy for those in power to like sell, to like market or whatever. And I think it's conditioned within the status quo because people aren't comfortable really talking about, the other aspects, the diverse aspects that are happening within our lived experiences. And so I think it's definitely teachers too, that deficit thinking. They see someone who might be an immigrant, right, and just assume maybe like all of these different types of ideas. And so that actually needs to be sort of unpacked. And that's where I think that wheelhouse of positionality is often a way to like really think about their own biases that come in and recognize that and hopefully do some interrogation.
Thank you. So we're technically over time, but if there was another short comment or question, please feel free. But otherwise, if there is not, then we can all prepare for the next concurrent panel that is beginning at 1 and continue conversations that we have all started today.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And we will see you at the next panel session.